Okay, so thank you everybody for joining today. I know this was a hot topic. I think out of all of the sessions that we had, this one was second in the list of number of registrants that we had. So lots of interest in this topic. So we have two great presenters here, and I'm going to talk very little and pass it over to them, let them introduce themselves and share what we're going to be chatting about today.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrie. I'll start. I am Joy Granetz, and I am a clinical neuropsychologist in Charlotte, and I'm a part of the practice Alderwood Psychological Services. And primarily, what I do is neuropsych testing, and many of you have probably had some testing done with your kiddos in the past, and so you might be familiar with that process. But that's kind of what I am most interested in is more the assessment, and working memory in particular has always been something that I've just always had a fascination with. So I'm really happy to get a chance to talk about it today in depth. Josefine, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Josefine Eriksson, and I am also a licensed psychologist with a background in neuropsych testing and school psychology. So I have worked a lot in schools and outpatient practices. I do a lot of neuropsych and neurodevelopmental assessments, and so really passionate about doing these evaluations and thinking about what are our children's strengths, what are the areas that they're struggling in, so that we can really individualize what's going to help them, right? And so we'll talk a lot about this kind of as we go through the presentation, but sometimes what we see first is the behaviors or the emotional side of things, but coming to better understand what's behind that is can be so helpful. And so we'll talk a lot about how that relates to the working memory piece of things. But yeah, I'm excited to be here, and we'll go ahead and get started.
And just kind of piggybacking on what Carrie said, definitely ask your questions as we're going through things. We have some structure for the talk, of course, but I think it would be even more interesting if, if there's certain things that are more interesting to this audience, that we're happy to kind of go down those paths as needed. So definitely chime in on the chat box, or even unmute and ask your questions as we're going through things.
Yeah. And Carrie, it does sound like, because this is helpful too, it sounds like lower school is primarily here, or kind of elementary age children.
We have a large handful of lower, and then we have, I'd say, about 3 middle to upper.
Okay.
It looks like.
Perfect. Cool.
All right, great. All right, well, we were just going to start by, I'm not going to go down too far of a rabbit hole of the brain and neurology here. I think we're really going to be focusing today on keeping things more practical, but I just wanted to spend just a quick second talking a little bit about the brain and the fact that working memory is a brain process. It's housed in that frontal lobe, and it's one of the executive functions. So you may be familiar with this already, but the executive functions are those processes that allow us to plan things out and focus our attention, remember instructions, manage multiple tasks simultaneously. And there are two primary strands that make up that executive functioning processing ability. So one is the metacognitive side of this term, and then there's the social and emotional side. So working memory is falling under that metacognitive strand, and you can think about it as being associated with many aspects of attention and learning. So while that social and emotional side is dealing more with your self-regulation and your impulse control, that metacognitive is more along the lines of like organization and planning and remembering things as it's coming in. So one reason that working memory has always been really fascinating to me is because of how critical it is to so many different abilities. So we are using our working memory just constantly. So if that's a weakness, it can have a really big impact on functioning across the board. But on the positive side, if you can improve it, it has a massive impact on that student's ability to function across the board academically, as well as just sort of, functionally, socially, in all sorts of things, getting their activities of daily living done. So I think because it's so critical, there's a lot of room for growth if you're able to support it and improve it. All right, so I wanted to just spend a quick moment of just sort of operationally defining what working memory is. It can be a little bit confusing in terms of what type of memory are we talking about, and also how is it different from just regular short-term memory. So working memory is that ability to temporarily allow us to store and manipulate incoming information in our minds. So a lot of people think about it as almost like a sticky note, or like a mental workspace that we're able to hold and manipulate and keep that information that's coming in, and allows us to process that information briefly while also doing something with it while we're trying to complete a task. So it's very much in the short term, but it isn't exactly the same as short-term memory, because short-term memory, as we define it, is really just kind of keeping that information in mind for just a few seconds and not really doing anything with it. So, if I asked you to gave you a phone number and you just took that information in, that's not exactly what we're talking about with working memory. It's a part of it, but working memory takes it a little bit to the next level. So, if I asked you to remember the numbers 4932, short-term memory would be 4932. Working memory would be able to will enable you to be able to say those numbers in reverse order, right? So then you've got to not only hold that information in mind, but do something with it. So that's kind of that working component to the working memory. Now there's two, brain science has shown us there's two aspects, and one is called the phonological loop, which could be also, I think about as kind of more on the auditory side of things. So holding auditory information that's coming in mind. And then there's another side of the coin, which is the visual spatial side, or you could think about that as more like visual working memory, where you're holding visual information or mentally visualizing things to be able to keep that information in mind. So you might have a neuropsych or psych ed evaluation, and you might have seen, for instance, one element of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children breaks those two things down. So there's tests that look at auditory working memory, like the digit span, and then there's visual working memory side, where kids have to try to remember pictures. So you might be able to see sometimes you see a global weakness with working memory. Sometimes you see an imbalance, like this child might be very good at visual working memory, but really struggles with that auditory working memory. Or maybe it's not a problem for that student. So you see all sorts of different profiles in the testing, and understanding that profile can be really helpful for just, in terms of figuring out the best learning style for that student. So I would just, I guess, summarize that by saying I picture it kind of like a mental notepad, where you're jotting things down in your head and having to keep that information. However, it's almost like one of those magic slate, boards from long ago, where the information fades quickly unless it's kept in mind. So there's an element of that information that, while it is a sticky note, it's not a permanent sticky note. It's vanishing sticky note. So you really have to keep that information in mind to be able to kind of get the task done that you want to try to complete.
Yeah, and Joy, I was just going to add to what you were saying earlier, when working memory is so important in so many different aspects of our life, right? And if working memory is not a weakness for us as the adult or the parent or the teacher, we kind of take for granted how much working memory does play a role in so many of these, sometimes what we think is such a basic task. So it's just kind of important to keep that in mind, especially for our kids.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions so far? No? All right, we'll keep us going. So kind of what we were saying, right? So working memory is going to impact our daily life in so many different ways. And so when we break it down, one of them is primarily organization, right? So working memory helps us hold information in our mind. It's what helps us plan tasks. We have to be able to think ahead, break things down into smaller steps, and kind of keep track of what we're doing, right? So everything from asking our kids to organize their backpacks for school or go clean their room to kind of planning a project. Each of those things requires us to be able to break things down and hold on to all of those pieces in working memory, right? So when we say, hey, run upstairs and pack your backpack, put your math book in there, your science notebook, pack your lunch, and then if it's PE day, throw your gym clothes in, right? And so that's a lot of steps to have to hold on to and to organize and work through. And so if we don't have strong working memory, that organizational piece, kids can really struggle with. Working memory is also going to help us maintain our focus, right? By really holding the most relevant pieces of information in our mind while we're also screening out those other distractors. And so when we think about kids listening to teachers' instructions in class, right? Or following a conversation, even, it can play out socially too. We have to be able to kind of hold on to all of those pieces in our working memory. We might lose track of what's going on in the conversation or in the middle of class. And so working memory helps us maintain that focus. It also helps us with problem solving skills, and that plays out in social problem solving as well as academic problem solving, right? So if we think about solving a math problem, Sam has 5 apples, he gives 2 to a friend, and then he buys 4 more. How many does he have now? So we're thinking about holding on to the numbers, doing the subtraction, and then adding on more. So there's a lot of pieces that we might struggle with for the problem solving piece there, or even problem solving through building a Lego set or putting a bookshelf together. If we struggle with the working memory piece and holding on to each of those steps and working through that, maybe we have to kind of constantly recheck the instructions, or we forgot where we left off, and so then we get a little bit lost. So problem solving skills can also be impacted. And then oftentimes, one of the first things that parents will often say is, they just really struggle to remember things, right? Or I told them to go do X, Y, and Z, and they just totally came back and had done one of them and forgotten the other ones. And that's because, like we said, that working memory piece is essential for holding that in our mind. Sometimes I'll think about it as kind of like a cognitive workspace also. So if we have too much on our desk, and there's binders and notebooks and a computer, and it's taking up all that space, then we don't have a lot of room left to do the work, right? And so the more clutter kind of we have, the more difficulty we're going to have remembering each of those tasks and what we're asked to do. And so coming to understand why that's hard is really important. And so we see that working memory kind of impact our life, or our daily life in different ways.
And I'll just tack on real quick in there too. I think as we're talking about what working memory is, you can kind of hear the undertone of what it isn't. So it doesn't have anything to do with the child's ability to remember, like a family vacation that you went on last year or things like that. When people, I think, very quickly jump to a long-term memory or what they're so good at remember, they can tell me things they did, 5 years ago, but they can't seem to get ready for school in the morning. So you can probably, as we're fleshing out what working memory really is, you can start to see the difference between what it is and what it isn't.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like what the encoding process, like how does the information get in there, right? And if we have good working memory, it helps the short-term memory, it helps us get that information into long-term memory also. We kind of see working memory play out in different ways depending on where we're at in our lifespan, right? And so for our younger kids, we might first start to see behavior problems, right? If a child's struggling with working memory, they're going to be struggling to follow directions, and so then that challenge might be they're not quite fitting in class, right? Or they're not listening to those instructions, and so that might be what we see in those early years. As kids get to elementary elementary school, there may still be behavior problems, but what might start to stand out a little bit more is that they're falling behind academically, right? They're struggling to focus during lessons. And so, in early elementary school, maybe they're having difficulty learning how to read, right? So those are the things that might first stand out. As kids progress through middle school and high school, we're looking at paying attention, and we're needing them to stay focused for longer periods of time, right? So there's that added demand on that working memory. And so we might continue to see struggles with learning and failing to perform throughout high school. And that ultimately, without the right supports and the right accommodations, is going to cause difficulty getting into college or whatever it might be that they want to or choose to do after high school. And so then when we get into our early 20s, and the other thing is executive functioning skills and the frontal lobe in general continues to develop essentially through the age of 25, right? And so some of these things kind of naturally come along. But as we shift to our 20s, kids are expected to be more independent with these things, right? And so they have to self-manage all of the things that they're supposed to do. So they might start to have difficulty prioritizing, right? Figuring out, okay, I have all these different classes. What do I have to do this week to make sure I get that assignment in by Thursday, right? How do I break this down? How do I work with all of these pieces to get to where I need to be? And so if without the right supports in college, we're going to have some difficulty graduating, right? And then that focus shifts to work as we get into adulthood. And again, that independence piece, managing our time, it is really, really important when we're working. And so then we might have difficulties with promotions at jobs or staying sharp enough to feel like we're getting to where we want to be in our career, right? So depending on the age of our kids, and then also throughout adulthood, it kind of plays out a little bit differently. Joy, anything you want to add there?
I don't think so, no.
Any-
Yes, but it tends to peak around the age of 25 and then start going downhill from there.
That I will say that transition period to college can be a really or towards the end of high school, when we think about testing, can be a really good time, especially if you haven't had an evaluation in a long time, to get some updated information around where are our strengths and where are our differences at that point, because that will really help ensure more a successful transition to college, right? What are they needing at that point in time? Because that's when they are expected to be more independent and navigate all of this on their own. So something to think about.
Great. We did want to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about academics, since the talk is related to students. So I just wanted to touch upon how working memory can influence things like reading, writing, math. Really, again, kind of can impact things across the board globally. About 10 to 15% of students have working memory deficit of some sort. And oftentimes that can lead to below average performance in different aspects of learning, because working memory is so important for things like reading comprehension, problem solving, organization. So it really can affect academics globally. So we'll start with reading. I think it's a good place to start. In terms of the impact of working memory on reading, most of the time where you're going to see it is reading comprehension, which is, obviously an important part of the reading process. So working memory is responsible for holding that information, holding the words and phrases from the beginning of a sentence to the latter part of the sentence. If you're reading, a little bit older and you're reading more complex passages, you think about how much information you're actually needing to juggle in your mind as you're going through the reading process, right? Many students who have dyslexia, what I see is that they're working so hard on just the actual decoding portion of the reading that they don't have a lot of leftover room for holding and manipulating that meaningful information in mind. So they kind of lose the joy of reading, because the act of reading is actually taking up so much mental space that you don't really have that leftover room to process and enjoy what you're reading. I even see it with dyslexia sometimes early on with being able to hold those sounds in mind. So if you're decoding a long word, you have to, you're sounding those words out, and you have to hold those sounds in mind and then blend them all together when you get to the end. And even sometimes you can see working memory impacting that decoding process. And kids with dyslexia often have other things that are going on with phonological processing and other, there's a lot of juggling that happens in the act of reading. But, when you look at the big picture, that reading comprehension part too, like a student needs to remember what they've read in the first paragraph to be able to understand the connections in subsequent paragraphs. So there's really a lot of working memory demand in the reading process. Writing also has a lot of working memory demands. If you ever think about doing a task analysis of what our brains are really doing when we're writing, you really break it down. There's just a lot that you have to do. Working memory allows us to plan the sentence that we want to write. We've got to structure the argument. We've got to edit as we go. Obviously, we've got things like capitalization and punctuation and vocabulary and spelling. There's just so many things that we are holding in mind as we're trying to get that sentence on the paper. It's really quite demanding if you really think about it. And then when you get into the older grades, writing essays and being able to remember your thesis statement and keep all that information kind of moving in that organized manner. So working memory can definitely have a big impact on the writing process. And then mathematics, for sure. This is another area, especially for mental math. Solving any kind of math problem in your head is certainly holding and manipulating a lot of information in mind. So, I think mental math, for sure, word problems, big demand, or if there's any situation where the student is not permitted to use scratch paper, or sometimes it's not that they're not permitted, but they don't want to. Sometimes kids are allowed to use scratch paper, but they maybe have something going on with their fine motor skills or dysgraphia. And so they will avoid writing at all costs. And they decide that they're going to just try to do it in their mind. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So, trying to make sure that kids are using the best strategies to minimize the impact of working memory fails, because in mathematics, obviously, if you make one mistake along the way, you get the wrong answer, and you get the whole problem wrong. So you can see academically, many students with learning disabilities, attention disorders, struggle with working memory, and you can sort of see it showing up globally in academics.
Any questions about the academic piece or impact on the academic piece so far? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the social emotional piece. So I'm going to start with the emotional side of things. Our kids that have lower working memory, they are working really hard throughout their school day, right? They are working really hard to get through their homework because they're juggling so much, right? And so there's an additional level of effort that they might be putting in. And so for a lot of our kids, you might see a lot of frustration, right? That frustration can lead to shutting down. It can lead to not wanting to do the work. It can lead to acting out behaviors, right? So we might see, we also see a lot of anxiety, right? They sit down, they want to do well, but that added demand on the working memory is really frustrating and fatiguing. And so you might see some anxiety develop. And then that kind of plays out. And so the emotions put behind it, and then that impacts the behavior, right? Sometimes we see self-esteem impacted over time, right? Because they're working so hard to get through the tasks. And so I'm feeling like they can't do it or feeling like they can't remember. So there is an emotional aspect to this. And then depending on what that emotion is can guide some of those behaviors that we're seeing, right? And then then there's the social piece. So working memory absolutely plays a role in social interactions that we have. So like we said earlier, kind of following conversations, right? If we're really trying hard to pay attention and focus and work with all the pieces that our working memory is holding on to, we might get distracted. We might go off topic in conversations and not necessarily respond appropriately, right? Or we might have difficulty remembering like the rules of games or in sports and soccer and those early years, learning all those steps, right? And so then that might start to play out socially or just being able to connect with kids. And navigating friendships, you have to be able to kind of recall what happened last time and or within a certain situation to respond appropriately. And so sometimes we see them struggle socially as well. I'm curious if people are comfortable, anything that you have noticed at home that stands out from kind of like a social emotional perspective? No. Okay. All right. Joy, anything you want to add there?
No, I think it's just reinforcing the point that this is something that can really impact all things.
Okay.
Like what's an example of what you're talking about? Like have we seen, I'm sure the answer is yes, I've seen something like this at home. I'm trying to figure out what types of things you're looking to know if we've had it.
Yeah, no, just kind of if there's like an emotional response that you see at home that you think might be related to kind of just overload of working memory, right? Or maybe you're seeing something socially play out with friends, is there, that you think might be related to the working memory, if there's any questions there or comments.
Mm-hmm. I don't have a question, but I'm sure there's something.
That's all right. No worries. Just a quick note on medication. So this is outside of our scope of practice. However, especially when we think about ADHD and the connection between working memory and ADHD, there absolutely is. There are medications that can help with that. They don't necessarily improve working memory, but what a lot of our specifically ADHD medications do are they work on dopamine and norepinephrine, right? So dopamine is going to help increase the focus, and norepinephrine is going to help kind of reduce the distractions. And so if those are questions that you have, or if you feel like you've used accommodations and supports and kids are still really struggling with that working memory piece, definitely reach out to your pediatrician, a child psychiatrist. There's stimulant and non-stimulant options that can definitely be helpful. It's not a magic pill. So that's, I think, the important part that we'll get to in terms of accommodations and strategies. They kind of have to be paired together in order to have the most success with it.
I was just going to take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about the CogMed program, which is a working memory training program. So this program is meant to try to help students expand their working memory capacity. And I think for students who have significant weaknesses with working memory, this could be a good option. It is an intensive program, so it's definitely a commitment. If a student was going to do it, it does take some commitment. It's not just like an app or like fun and games type of thing. It's an intervention, but for students who are really struggling in this area, this could be an option for an intervention. So basically what it is there's 3 different versions of the program. There's a preschool version, a school-aged version, and then a version for adults or older teens. It is done at home. It's done on a computer with support. So you'd have to work with somebody who provides CogMed. And the main part of the program is 5 weeks. So, and during that 5-week session, the students typically are logging in about 5 times per week. So 25 sessions overall, and each session lasting approximately an hour, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. I know the slide says 30 to 40 minutes. I think that's a little bit of an underestimate, actually. It's the basic concept is practice, mass practice. So these different activities are having kids hold and manipulate information in mind through these brain games, and having them do things in slightly different ways to just kind of use that part of the brain over and over again. Starts out wherever the kid is, and then tries to build and expand that capacity through practicing these different exercises. So this is just something I bring up because it's an option. Again, I would say it's a good option for students who are having, fairly significant working memory issues. If this is a big problem that they're having, this is an option to try to improve and expand that working memory capacity in a really kind of regimented manner. This would be one option. And then, of course, we always would supplement things like accommodations, which Josefine will talk about next.
Another thing to think about in terms of interventions or things that you can do to executive functioning coaches have a lot of experience with working memory weaknesses. And so especially if kids are really struggling and towards the end of middle school or in high school, they're tutors that specialize in executive functioning and working memory. And so that can be a really helpful tool. Again, a lot of it is repetition, but also figuring out what works for each individual kid and student, right? And so when you think about those transition years to college, that can be a really helpful tool to help build kids' awareness around how they struggle and what strategies are going to be most helpful for them.
Yeah, I think that helps, for parents to not have to be the homework police and saving that relationship and not having to be that person, but then having that executive coach come in and help them set up their space and help them figure out kind of what tools work for their brain.
Absolutely.
It looks like we have someone who raised their hand and may have a question, if now's an okay time.
Yes, please feel free.
Hi, this is Tim Johnson. It actually relates to what we're talking about. And I was thinking, especially when you mentioned the CogMed program, does that have the capability to do any assessment as well? Because I was trying to think through, as I think about my son, I noticed these things, but it'd be nice to kind of come up with a baseline of where he might have a deficit and then what we can improve upon systematically. Is there any recommendation you had for that?
Yeah, I think the assessment process itself, so the type of testing, for instance, that Josefine and I do, helps to just determine whether or not there is a working memory deficit. So you can do certainly a comprehensive evaluation, and that's one avenue. However, there on the CogMed side of things, they do assessments. Actually, it's very data-driven program. So there is, at the beginning, you do get they do some analysis of your performance at the very front end in the first couple of days of the program, so that you have a start index. For instance, they'll give you an actual score on a standard score profile, and then you're always comparing where you are to that number to see how you're improving. So it is very data driven. So I guess it's a long answer for yes, there is assessment, and I think there's multiple ways to get that information. You can also do an assessment by a questionnaire, getting a rating scale and seeing how someone's doing in executive functioning across the board. You've probably filled out parent rating scales, teacher rating scales. Sometimes those can be helpful for determining whether functionally someone's having some working memory challenges in their lives.
Great, thanks. That's helpful.
All right, so we'll talk about some strategies and accommodations. We'll just go through kind of some basic ones, and then if there are ways that your own kids are struggling that you want to ask questions about so that we can really individualize it to what you're seeing, feel free to jump in. But something that's not on here that I also want to start off with is kind of what we mentioned earlier. Working memory is a part of the brain that's most impacted when we're not sleeping well, when periods of stress, periods of anxiety, right? If we haven't eaten well, right? So we always want to make sure that we're taking a holistic view at what's going to help them really reach their optimal working memory abilities. So always kind of keep that in mind. But overall accommodations, so especially for our younger ones, even for our teens, making eye contact before before we tell them to do something, just to make sure that we have their focus, right? Are they ready to hear us? And then also that gives them an opportunity to ask questions if they didn't catch something. We really want to keep distractions to a minimum, since that working memory capacity is limited, right? The more space we can free up for them to just focus on the task at hand, the better that's going to be, right? So thinking about keeping distractions to a minimum when they're doing homework, or areas of the classroom that are going to help keep them most focused, really reducing that background noise. Not being afraid to use written reminders, right? Checklists, picture schedules for our younger kids, Post-it notes, right? So you might put a Post-it note if your kid is struggling to get ready for school in the morning. Maybe you put a Post-it note on the mirror in the bathroom, and you've got a couple of things for them, and using visuals for our younger kids. The written reminders too, as kids get older, then it's not the parent always reminding your kid what to do, right? And so that can also help protect the relationship in a lot of ways. And don't be afraid to use cell phones, text messages, reminders on our phones, right? There's a lot of apps too out there that we can talk about that can be helpful. Prompting and cueing, so pointing to an area of the room if there's something that you're wanting them to do, can help kind of jog that memory. And making sure that we're asking them to do kind of one thing at a time, that we're not overwhelming them and giving them lots of or too much information. The same thing goes for when they're doing homework, right? Let's have them start with one subject and make sure they're not kind of jumping from one task to the next. So really doing things sequentially, and one at a time. When you're giving instructions, also, having them repeat back or kind of paraphrase what you asked them to do, to make sure that they caught all those pieces, or again, have that opportunity to ask if they need. When it comes to learning, and it kind of depends on the subject, but repetition, right? Repetition, chunking things into smaller, more manageable parts. When you think about how you remember a phone number, there's a reason we kind of remember it in that 3-3-4 order. Mnemonics, right? Every good boy does fine. Hopefully that jogs your memory back to like a music class when you're younger, or Roy G. Biv, remembering the colors of the rainbow. And as kids get older, right, you can apply that to other things that they're asked to kind of memorize, whether it's science class, social studies. They might make up their own mnemonic devices. Numeric peg systems is basically rhyming. So we're going through 1 through 10, what word can they associate with 1, 2, 3, 4 to help jog their memory. Joy was talking a little bit earlier about kind of like the verbal, the phonological loop, and then more of the visual spatial sketch pad. So asking kids to visualize things, right? That multisensory component, the more we can think about, give it a picture, the more they can pull from it. And so, or even pictures as a prompt or a cue, that's going to help them pull out that information. Joy, what kind of things do you want to jump into or add to that? I have a couple other ones that aren't on the slide.
Yeah, no, I would just say some of these strategies can actually be really fun for kids to learn. So I would say if you are going to play around with some of these things, just have fun with it. There are a couple of books that I thought I would mention, just in terms of if somebody is really interested in this topic and wants to take even a deeper dive than our discussion today. Some of these strategies are outlined really well in a book called Unlimited Memory. So that's for like really tangible memory strategies. And like I said, I think it can be kind of a fun thing to play around with, and especially like if you're helping your kids study for a test or something like that, or they need to, have something rotely memorized, you can see what tool works the best for that kiddo. A couple of other, if there's interested readers, Smart But Scattered. This is reversed on this, but this one's Smart But Scattered for teens. There's another book that's meant for more for younger kids, Smart But Scattered. Just Smart But Scattered is probably I would say, I don't know, maybe K to 5th or 6th grade, and then the teens is the next level up. And then this one I really like too, which is called Executive Function in the Classroom. Also very practical strategies for thinking about how some of these weaknesses that we talk about impact academics. So the kids may have all of the the resources that they need to be successful. But when working memory or one of the other executive functions gets in the way, it can really impact their performance, even though, they're really bright and they have tremendous resources. They're just not able to show what they know sometimes. And that can be really frustrating. So anything we can do to try to support that and get ahead of it. And then the last one I had in mind, just a book, if you're really interested in working memory specifically, is called The Overflowing Brain. So those are some resources I would just point you to if you're interested to maybe learn a little bit more about some of these strategies and think about how to support your students.
There's also a website, and I believe it has an app too, but I have to check, called Brainscape, that can help with kind of like the memorization in a lot of courses. It helps you make kind of flashcards, and it has like optimal intervals for like how quickly the information is presented that can help with learning. There's also a podcast called Quick Brain, I believe, that has some good kind of like applicable strategies to everyday life. So those are some other ones to check out.
And Carrie, it's actually KWIK Brain, because his last name is actually Quick, KWIK.
And that brings us to kind of the end of our PowerPoint, at least, but we will open it up to questions, comments. Go ahead, Courtney. Yeah.
I always have one. Sorry. So I had this question right at the beginning, and I was like, I'm going to wait and see if we touch on this specific thing. My son has autism and ADHD, and he said the other night, and I remember reading this about some poor nonverbal girl who then explained this, the lack of filtering of external sounds and noises and visuals and everything. And he said to me the other night, Mom, there's a camera in my brain and it films everything all the time. And so all of these strategies, on one hand, that's cool, right? But then on the other hand, it's like, how on earth is he supposed to kind of filter that and know, like, okay, this is all happening, but now I'm being asked to do this, A, B, C. Like, do any of the things that y'all have, because everything y'all have said is awesome and so helpful, and I'm going to go get it all and look at it all. And his IQ test is like, everything's fine. And then the working memory is way low. So that was the thing that I know is, holding him back or, getting in his mental way. I guess I'd love your thoughts knowing that for a kid like that. And I don't know if other people I don't want to make this just about my kid, but I do think it's something that happens a lot in autism, and kids may not say that they're getting all this information at once and they can't filter it. What of those strategies that you just laid out have you seen work better than others? Like, where should we start if that's the kind of kid we're talking about?
Yeah, I'll Josephine, I'm gonna let you chime in on that, but I just want to like what I hear in his comment is kind of a figure ground type of issue, that the figure ground, like we're supposed to be, our brain is wanting to concentrate on the figure and screen out the ground, right? So so this can be an issue if he's kind of not able to do that. Then you think about everything we just talked about is compounded by the fact that he's getting a lot more information. A lot of information is coming out, stuff that we would if we don't have an autistic diagnosis or don't have this particular challenge, we're able to screen that out and not pay attention to that.
Right.
So it even makes all of this that much worse. I think a lot of environmental, some of the things we talked about too, like smaller environment, kind of paring things down, removing the distractions as much as we can would be important. Writing things down, kind of think about all the different ways we could externalize that working memory. We're not going to be able to do it 100% of the time, but if we can maybe set his environment up for success, that's going to minimize the impact of all of that. Josefine, you probably have some things to add to that.
Yeah. Courtney, do you mind me asking how old he is?
8.
8, yeah. So, I mean, there's a sensory component to this, right? His sensory world is totally overwhelmed and overloaded. And so that does impact working memory. And so I'm not sure if you've ever had like an occupational therapy kind of consult, but I think about some sensory-based recommendations too of what can kind of help reduce that load. And so, and then like Joy said, really just breaking it down to like one thing at a time, being really mindful of where we're asking him to do his work. Giving him breaks, right? Like the difference between proactive breaks and then breaks as needed, because the more we overwhelm that system, the less efficient we are. And so those breaks can kind of help him reset. Making sure that there's a goal around like self-advocating for himself, right? Being able to ask, say, hey, I need a break, or I don't know what I'm doing, or kind of I feel overwhelmed, right? And so then we can start to really individualize it to what he needs. And so I don't know if that totally answers your questions, but those are the things that I would probably start with. And then you can start to use the individual strategies, but just slowing it down and breaking it down for him.
Yep. Okay. No, that's cool. That's helpful. Thanks.
Any other questions or things you guys are seeing at home?
Before we jump into potentially some other questions, because I did promise that I would stop the
Sorry.
recording. No, Courtney, I love that you are always willing to jump in and unmute and chat. I just know that there are some who aren't. So I am going to stop the recording, and then we can kind of reopen the Q&A here. But before I do that, first I want to say thank you. Even just what you said about being able to make some of these things fun. I don't know. I just think that stands out. Like my daughter, I think taking like that multi-step direction and things is something, and she's 5 years old, and it's something she struggles with. And so we like make it a game at home where I'm like, okay, close your eyes. I'm going to tell you 5 things you have to go do. And she has to like picture it, tell it back to me, and then go do it. And now it's like a game that we're playing. And I'd never thought of it in this sense, but it's like, oh yeah, like that's what I'm working on. That's what we're doing. So I have really appreciated that. And I do have one question for both of you that I want to ask before I stop the recording. I spend so much of my day in the role that I'm in reading these evaluations, and you both mentioned that that's really what you spend your time doing, and that's where parents can go if they're looking for a baseline to find if this is something their child is struggling with. And I have to just first compliment you. Not every evaluation is the same or as easy to read, and the ones that I get from both of you are always so easy to read and get right to the point, and I'm excited when I see them come across my table, because I'm like, yes, okay, this is going to be a good one. So what is your current wait time like, wait list? That's always a big question I get when a family is trying to get a new evaluation. What does that look like for you right now?
Great question. Normally it's thank you, first of all. that actually is so nice to hear that that obviously we spend a lot of time writing those reports and trying to kind of make sure everyone's individualized, and it means a lot to hear that. So thank you. And also that someone's reading them. But wait time for, I think it's typically a couple months, like 3 or 4 months, is kind of an average wait time, but we're really good about keeping active cancellation lists. So a lot of times, even if you get on, if you're, really wanting to get in sooner and we've got a little, 3-month wait, we do move people up. So a lot of times that process isn't actually as long as anticipated. And we, we're very mindful that a lot of times when people make the decision that they want to get some testing, they really want to get it done right away at that point. So we do try to keep that in mind and keep things as efficient as possible. Josefine, I don't know what your wait is at the moment.
Yeah, I just came back from maternity leave, so my daycare is a little bit tricky right now. But anyway, I think anywhere from like 2 to 3 months, and again, we can always try to move people up if we need to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I want to leave time for questions about your topic for others, but I just wanted to sneak that into the recording if I could. But thank you very much.